Alabama and Ohio State, two teams that this year weren't the same and really weren't what we expected them to be to a certain degree. Alabama, when we think of Alabama and Nick Saban, we think of this team that just dominates you, that imposes their will. We don't think of a team that just scampers along, that just crawls its way to the playoff for greatness, like 2014 Florida State did, for example. It's exactly what Alabama did this year. Alabama, outside of very few games, namely performances against Ole Miss, Miami, Georgia in the SEC championship game, they crawled through most games. It was a struggle. They didn't look dominating. They didn't look like the normal Alabama team, especially the 2020 Alabama team that was only a year removed from this team. They didn't look like that team at all. Very little image of domination was inscribed in this Alabama team. Nonetheless, they went 13-2. Josh Pate went as far to say that this was Nick Saban's best coaching job with what he was given and the injuries he had. They went 13-2, won the SEC, beating Georgia in the SEC championship game, but lost in a rematch in the national title game. Ohio State, on the other hand, completely missed the playoffs altogether. Ohio State went 11-2. They won the Rose Bowl, but they lost at home to Oregon early, and their hopes of reaching the playoff were completely derailed when they traveled to Ann Arbor and they were dominated by Michigan in a 42-27 loss. Ohio State being a team that, like Alabama, did have a lot of youth, but they also had a lot of experience, and their performance on defense was completely unacceptable, which resulted in the complete revamping of their staff. But we'll get into that and more into Alabama here in a few seconds. I believe that these two teams are your clear, cookie-cut clear number 1 and number 2 teams entering 2022. And they're kind of interchangeable. You can make an argument for Ohio State being number 1. You could make an argument for Alabama being number 1. But what separates them from the rest of the pack, especially the three other participants in the playoff this year, Michigan, but especially Georgia, and even more so Cincinnati, all three of those teams completely lose one side of the ball. Cincinnati loses the majority of their starters who were super seniors. Georgia, loses big portions of their defense. Stetson Bennett kind of hinted at a possible transfer. JT Daniels is probably going to transfer out as well. And James Cook just declared for the draft. And Michigan loses, in summary, their entire defense. Alabama and Ohio State return a lot of pieces on both sides of the ball, and they both, especially on offense, return a lot of promise and explosiveness and experience. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to present to you reasons why Alabama could be number 1, reasons why Ohio State could be number 1, and we're going to talk about it. And speaking of talking about it, comment your thoughts down below and who your number 1 team is entering the 2022 season. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. It's just that simple. I'm going to be doing a giveaway at 3,000, and the more you like my video, the more you watch it, and hitting that subscribe button, YouTube just loves to eat it up and spit it back out into the algorithm, and it helps me get more views. So we mutually benefit each other through that process. But anyway, let's get into it. Let's get into the good stuff. First of all, we're going to talk about Alabama. And the Tide this year, as I mentioned before, had a lot of struggles. The Miami game, you watched that, and most of us thought that Miami was going to be a decent team. They were going to build off of some of last year's success with De'Aaron King. You watched that game. You thought, oh, nothing changed. We're right where we ended in 2020. They're going to win the whole darn thing. And then you watched some other games. You watched, I think it was the Mercer game, the Florida game. And then later in the season, it was A&M, it was LSU. A&M was actually a loss. And then finally Auburn. You watched those games and you realized, no, a lot changed. A lot changed from 2020 to 2021. All those players who left to be drafted, I think Alabama had an insane amount of first rounders, affected the team. And Bryce Young and Will Anderson were leaders throughout this year. A lot of times they were leading guys who were older than them and more experienced, and juniors and seniors. And these two return. Unlike from 2020 to 2021, where your key guys left for the NFL, your key guys are staying. Bryce Young and Will Anderson, I don't even think are draft eligible. Actually, they have to stay another year before they can get drafted. Both of these guys are leaders and they're elite. And you can make the argument that these two are the best two players in the nation. Young won the Heisman. I think he has 47 touchdown passes. And Will Anderson he leads the nation in sacks. And he's arguably the best defensive player. And Nick Saban, even in the post-game conference, after losing the national title game, he thanked these two guys and said that these two guys are the hardest working and best members of the team, and that they take responsibility for the loss, but they've done a lot for the team. And I think it speaks to the situation that Alabama was put in this year, which, speaking of situation, Alabama's running back and wide receiver rooms will have greater depth than they did this past season now that it's been concluded. But we all remember John Mechie being injured, and then Jamison Williams, having the targeting call against Auburn, tearing his ACL, sadly, in the national title game. And then we all remember, of course, the running backs, in specifically Chase McClellan and Roydell Williams, who also had injuries, which left only Trey Sanders and Brian Robinson Jr. to do anything. And Robinson Jr. got injured a few times, notably the Auburn game. He had a long run and then went down, and he wasn't even up to full speed, up to full capacity in the SEC championship game. So Alabama had depth issues at wide receiver and running back specifically. That, I believe, will change. You're only losing Brian Robinson Jr. to the NFL, no one else. Trey Sanders, Chase McClellan, Roydell Williams, and Kamar Wheaton are returning, and you also have Georgia Tech transfer Jahmyr Gibbs being added to the list. And from the 2022 recruiting class, you have incoming freshman, very talented young man, Emmanuel Henderson and Jamarian Miller. At wide receiver, Jamison Williams, the speedy Jamison Williams, will likely go to the NFL. Decisions from John Mechie III and Slade Bolden are something to watch for. But you got Ja'Cory Brooks, Trayshawn Holden, Javon Baker, G. Hall, JoJo Earl, Christian Leary, and many other talented names that I could just go on and on about, but I don't want to bore you. The point is, Alabama is not losing as much as they did after the conclusion of the 2020 season. They're actually returning a great amount of potential, and not just potential, but production as well. You saw action from guys like Ja'Cory Brooks when John Mechie III went down, and then when both of them were out in the national title game. Trayshawn Holden, Javon Baker, G. Hall is a name that I remember being mentioned and remember seeing him. Now, granted, all those backups were not nearly as good as Mechie and Williams are. And that's a question we're going to get to in a few seconds, is the issue of depth performance. But still, they have playing time. Where if Williams and Mechie leave, cool. Ja'Cory Brooks, Trayshawn Holden, they got some playing time this year as a result of injuries, which sucks for this year. But in the future, it can actually be, in a certain sense, it's like somewhat of a benefit to the backups, because now they have experience. They have a building block to build off of. The main question for Alabama is the issue of depth and performance on the overall offense minus the quarterback. You know Bryce Young is going to be good. He's the favorite to win the Heisman. If he wins it again, he likely deserves it. The question is, and outside of running back, too, as well, I mean, you return, quite frankly, four or five-star guys, and you're adding a really good transfer. But wide receiver, if Jamison Williams and John Mechie III leave, I'm anticipating Slade Bolden's going to stay. But if both of the main guys leave, who's going to step up and replace them, and can they replace them to full capacity? At tight end, Jaleel Billingsley is in the transfer portal. Cameron Latu, we'll see if he goes to the NFL or not. So we'll see what comes out of the tight end room. On the offensive line, you have Fedarian Mathis. That's D-line. Evan Neal, Chris Owens, and Kendall Randolph are off to the NFL, so that's 3 guys. And the offensive line, specifically the tackles, did not perform well at all. Bryce Young constantly getting pressure from good defenses. So on the offense, for depth, we'll see what happens. On defense, you do lose some guys. You got Christopher Allen off to the NFL, Fedarian Mathis and LeBrian Ray off, Henry To'o, there are decisions from him, and Josh Joby off to the NFL as well. But the defense this year, despite drawing criticism, the defense did a very good job for losing some starters. And they return as much, if not slightly more than the offense does. I don't think the defense is an issue for Alabama. Pete Golding is a very solid coordinator. You're not going to get a 2011-like Alabama defense when you have to prioritize offense in an offensive renaissance that is modern college football. That's Alabama for all of you. And now we're going to move on to Ohio State. Ohio State here is a slightly different story. It has a similar tone, but it's a more dramatic story because Ohio State never reached the playoff. Both of these teams were expected to reach the playoff. A lot of people thought a rematch was possible. I was a proponent of that. I thought Ohio State and Alabama would rematch after 2020. Alabama would once again win, but Ohio State would play it much closer, be a much more competitive game, and put themselves in position to come back and quite possibly win it all in 2022. And here they're in that position, except they never met Alabama in the first place, nor did they ever reach the playoffs. Their positive is they return so much talent and so much production on offense. It's crazy. Yet they're losing their best tight end, their two previously best wide receivers. You could argue Jackson Smith-Njigba was the best at the end of the year, and they also lose Nicholas Petit-Frere and Thayer Munford. So they do lose some guys, but all their running backs return. CJ Stroud returns with a loaded set of wide receivers. Jackson Smith-Njigba, Harrison Jr. You also got Julian Fleming, Emeka Egbuka. Those are just names that I'm trying to ring off the top of my head. G. Scott as well. So you have so many talented wide receivers. Unlike Alabama, there's no worry about wide receiver depth. Brian Hartline is the best wide receivers coach in the nation. It's not going to happen. The question, as all of you know, unlike Alabama, is going to be the defense, but we'll get to that later. To add to the second point, the entire offense, but especially at running back and wide receiver, have elite depth. They all do. Even with Greg Studwara being fired because he couldn't recruit at the highest level and because the O-line had troubles, especially with run blocking this year, you still got talent at the O-line, and everywhere else you got large amounts of talent. CJ Stroud was second in the nation in passer rating. I think he was in the 180s. And after that Utah game, I imagine he was in the high 180s. So he's an elite QB. Travion Henderson and Mayan Williams, in my opinion, are both elite running backs. Jackson Smith-Njigba for sure is an elite wide receiver. I think Marvin Harrison Jr. is as well. I don't know if he's on the same level as Smith and Jigba. Probably not. But nonetheless, he had a great showing at the Rose Bowl. So offensive line might be the only question. But still, from what I'm garnering, you return a good amount of starters there as well. I think you return possibly the majority of the offensive line is what you do. And having a new O-line coach, the former OC from UCLA, you should be confident in Ryan Day's hiring there. Which, speaking of that, another positive of this team, Alabama, it was mainly related to the team. They're not having too many staff changes unless Bill O'Brien leaves for the NFL. For Ohio State, Ryan Day has made necessary tweaks to the staff. Bringing in Jim Knowles was the main one. Greg Studwara, I'd say, is like the cherry on top with the whipped cream. It's important, but it's mainly an add-on to a much bigger problem. Fixing the defense was always a bigger issue than fixing the offense, because at the end of the day, it wasn't Ohio State's offense's fault that they were losing games. It's that they couldn't stop a good O-line from running all over them, and that was the issue. So what did Ryan Day do? He hired Jim Knowles. I haven't heard much on Kerry Combs, honestly. If he's fired or if he's not, let me know what his new position is down below. I know Matt Barnes is the new defensive coordinator at Memphis. I'm presuming Coombs is staying with the team, but as a position coach, bringing in Knowles is, honestly, it's an amazing hire. Studwara was really that firing. You didn't necessarily need to happen, but Ryan Day isn't playing around. He wants to prove that this team is going to be playoff ready next year. And much like Alabama, I think it will be. Ohio State, they very much underperformed. They have an elite scheme. They run the best offense in the nation. Their offense this year was undoubtedly the best. The defense, which is the question that we have to talk about, was the ultimate issue. How quickly will the defense toughen up, or will it? Will it at all? And that's a fair question. Even with the hiring of as good of a coordinator as Jim Knowles is, the question has to be asked, will there even be noticeable or obviously noticeable improvement in 2022, or won't be? Ohio State on defense, you lost Haskell Garrett. You lost, I believe, Tyreek Smith, others as well. I heard Ronnie Hickman announced a return to the team, I believe, which is huge. He was the leading tackler and I think the leader in interceptions as well for the Buckeyes. So that's the question for Ohio State, is the defense. The entire defense is a question. The D-line play was very subpar, and the linebacker play was pretty atrocious up until the last game, where you saw a guy like Tommy Eichenberg finally step up and make some key plays. So that's Ohio State right there for you. A team that is not necessarily on the same level, at least for now, like Alabama is. Ryan Day isn't Nick Saban. He's still young. He's still learning. That's why a lot of these coaching changes have been made. That's why there has been some stubborn play calling. But Ohio State's still, in my opinion, a top 4, top 3, probably top 2 program in the years to come. It's up there, pretty close to Alabama. Same thing with Georgia. So that's just my opinion on both of these teams. And now we are going to get into my opinion. And my opinion is that Ohio State is the number 1 team. It's facts, I think. I look at their offense compared to Alabama's, and offense, as long as you don't completely forget the defense, like what Ohio State somewhat did this year, offense is now what wins you championships. It used to be defense wins you championships. There was a time for that. But there's a reason why Nick Saban now runs a spread or throws more than he runs for the most part, unless that's a complete mismatch against his opponent. There's a reason for that, because the modern game is offensively focused. Georgia was actually an exception to the rule to a large degree, and I'm curious as to wonder as if Georgia winning the national title is a sign of the game maybe tilting back to a more balanced or defensive focus. But for now, offense is what wins you championships, and there's far less questions for Ohio State's offense than there is for Alabama's. Ohio State doesn't lose their starting running back. Ohio State, they have arguably, you could argue, the best wide receiver in the nation returning there, and their backups did very well, played in a very elite level in the Rose Bowl, whereas Alabama's did not. Albeit Alabama's played against tougher defenses than Ohio State's did. Ohio State loses less of their O-line, and that's that, really, to be honest with you. The question is, for Ohio State, as I mentioned before, is the defense. Whereas if you're Alabama doesn't have too many questions on defense. You have the same coordinator that you've had since, if my memory serves me correctly, you have the same coordinator that you've had since 2019, maybe 2018, if I'm wrong. And he, with his team running a spread, has done a really good job at Alabama. This defense, for efficiency metrics, I believe, was top 5. And they lost a lot. And Will Anderson has done very well. The defense played Georgia, in my opinion, as tough as they could, because you really can't pin the pick 6 on that Alabama defense. But you can also make the case for Alabama to be number 1. I'm not going to, argue for a long section of time to defend this point. This is just my opinion. If you disagree, let me know down below, and let's have a conversation about it. That's what I love about college football, is the ability to have conversation, have differing viewpoints, and it not be so political or hostile. That's why I love college football. But I think Ohio State is the number 1 team. I think Alabama follows closely behind at number 2. Georgia's kind of in that tier 1.5 zone. They've proven that they can reach the next level. Kirby Smart's proven that he can be a Nick Saban. He can take that next step forward, but they do lose a lot next year. So I don't know if they'll be a top 2 team, a national championship team next year. I don't. But I think they're close, and then everyone else is kind of on a different, lower level than these two are. And that's that. That's all I got to say. I just wanted to make this video because it's interesting. This is the beginning of the off season, and I want to address the best teams. And then eventually we're going to talk about contenders, dark horse contenders, discuss Heisman stuff, recruiting, the transfer portal. It's all happening. I'm discussing everything this off season. So thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys around.